Okay, well, first of all, it's just incredible and wonderful to see such a great turnout for this event. So I'm very happy to see all of you here because I think this is going to be very worthwhile. So my name is Charlie Shad. I'm from the Next Steps team and the Thousand Oaks Hamlet. And those two groups jointly worked on developing this program for today. We hope you find it interesting and useful, but we also want to tell you that there are several more healthier aging programs following this in the next several months, which will be of great interest to all of you, I think, as well. So it's great that you're here and can get those on your calendar, at least in your mind. And the person that will tell you a little bit more about that is Jeanette Ward in just a couple of minutes. So all events have a little bit of business at the beginning, and I have two things. First of all, thank yous, because as every successful event, as you know, every successful event needs to have a team working to make it successful. And I want to thank the people of Ashby Village staff, which includes Andy, who made this possible, and Su Yin and Sigrid, whose hard work made it a reality. I'd also like to thank some other people, Mary Jo Powell, Don Hubbard, Roberta Pressman and her group, which all made additional contributions, which we appreciate. So thank you all. Secondly, I just want to take a minute to remind everybody how many outstanding presentations Ashby Village has put on in this past year. They really ramped it up. And it's been a very difficult year. And so that's a tremendous thing that they've done. I understand that KQED is kind of looking over their shoulder and watching us to see if we're competition for them now, giving them a run for their money. Seriously, the programs that Ashby Village has put on are that good. They're really terrific. And like public radio, you know that all programs and services cost money. So if you are able to and inclined to make any extra donation for Ashby Village today, it would be very, very welcome. It will be put to good use for future programs and activities to keep this going. And you can just click the app, or Su Yin can help you to make that donation. So now Jeanette's going to tell you just a little bit more about the upcoming health presentations, and then back to me, and I'll do a very brief introduction so we can get right into the program.
Thanks, Charlie. Just quickly, the Healthier Aging Initiative is pleased to work with Next Step and the Hamlet. Joining with neighborhood groups increases the array of informative events available to all of us here at Ashby Village. So if you have ideas of health-related presentations you would enjoy, please share them with us. And Healthier Aging is excited to offer its Spring Embracing Change presentation to introduce our new Ashby Village Kaiser Permanente partnership. Check the Ashby Village calendar for the first Kaiser event on April 22nd, 10:30 to noon, entitled Understanding Pain Through the Mind-Body Connection. Back to you, Charlie.
Okay, thanks, Jeanette. So now on to our program and to introduce our presenter, Saskia Kleinert. So you have all had the opportunity to see her resume, and it's very impressive. To that, I would just like to add one thing, that I know her to be a person who always strives for the highest standard of professionalism in her work and technical knowledge in the area of nutrition, and in fact, in all of her endeavors. So Saskia is going to give you a very good presentation today. It's with great pleasure I welcome her and pass the mic over to her to begin the presentation.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. I am very excited to see so many participants. My name is Saskia Kleinert. I'm a nutritionist, and I'm originally from Switzerland, hence my accent. We will begin the presentation in just a moment, and please make sure that if you have questions that you do write them in your chat window. We will have a Q&A segment at the end. And with that, I'm going to now share my screen and bring up my presentation. So today I will be presenting to you, as you know, on the topic of nutrition essentials for the aging body and mind. Of course, that brings up the question as to why this is even a topic worthy of discussion, right? Well, in a nutshell, the human body's nutritional needs change as we age, as does the body's ability to absorb nutrients from the food that we eat. And with those changes comes a risk of malnutrition and nutritional deficiencies, which then in turn can lead to a poor overall health outcome. Let's look at what research shows us in that regard. So a 2010 study that was published in the Journal of the American Geriatrics Society showed that, oh, I apologize, I clicked on the wrong thing. I was trying to move the speakers over a little bit. That examined 4,500 adults, showed that approximately 2/3 of them were either at a nutritional risk or were already malnourished. One of the particular types of malnutrition that we're concerned about is what we call protein energy malnutrition. And one of the reasons why we're concerned about it is because it's very prevalent, it's underdiagnosed, and therefore often left untreated, and it overlaps with frailty. We will go into all of these issues in depth as we go through the presentation. You may say, well, you know, what's the big deal if I'm undernourished? Well, for one thing, if you were to be hospitalized, if you're malnourished, you have a much, much greater risk of readmission and mortality. And remember, that means being hospitalized for any kind of reason, including needing a surgery, having an accident, having an infection. So clearly, we're talking about pretty serious issues here that are related to malnutrition and nutritional deficiencies. Now, the question is, of course, why are we at a risk of being malnourished as we get older? There are quite a number of reasons. For one, there is the fact that as we age, our assimilation of nutrients changes. That's a normal aspect of aging. It has to do with the fact that we secrete less gastric acid and less enzymes. One other reason is that we have digestive issues, GERD, diverticulitis, IBS interfering with absorption of nutrients. Medication-induced nutrient depletions is a big reason. And then things like decreased sense of smell and taste that leads to having a lack of appetite. Additionally, both our appetite regulation and our thirst regulations are blunted. And we therefore may not feel as hungry. We certainly don't feel as thirsty as when we are in our younger years. Dental problems and reduced amounts of saliva contribute to malnutrition. And then certainly also difficulty swallowing, which we call dysphagia. Alcohol induces nutrient depletion as well, especially if we drink more than the recommended amounts. And then simple things like the lack of energy to prepare a meal, not feeling like you want to do it because you're eating by yourself, decreased mobility that affects our shopping and our cooking abilities. So these are some reasons as to why we see malnutrition and nutritional deficiencies in the aging population. So what are we concerned about? We're concerned about a number of issues. So when we look at nutrition, we have something called macronutrients. Macronutrients means big nutrients, and we have 3 of them in total. There's protein, there are carbohydrates, and then there's fats. The one macronutrient that is of concern to us is protein. We also have what we call micronutrients. Those would be your minerals and your vitamins. And specifically, the ones we're concerned about in the aging population are iron, vitamin B12, vitamin D, folate, which is also called B9, vitamin B9, zinc, calcium, and biotin. Biotin is one of our B vitamins. Additionally, we're concerned about lack of adequate intake of fiber and hydration. So let us begin with protein. Why are we concerned about protein malnutrition? For one thing, it's the most common form of malnutrition in aging adults. Now, the effects of protein deficiency are quite serious, beginning with loss of muscle and bone mass, which then in turn lead to loss of strength and balance. And that in turn leads to an increased risk of falling. I am sure all of you are well aware of what the aftermath of a fall can mean to an aging person, and that the outcome of that can be lack of independence, as well as we see a very much of an increased risk of mortality within a year of a person who falls and, for example, breaks what we call a hip, which is actually not your hip, it's your leg bone. But we all know that we do not want to fall, that can lead to very bad outcomes. So why do we see this malnutrition of protein? Well, it's mostly the lack of consumption. For example, a study that was done in Maryland on 2,600 men and women who were over 60, between 65 and 85, found that only about a quarter of them, about a quarter of them were consuming inadequate amounts of protein. Now, that's a relatively large number of people not consuming enough protein. And you might wonder, why don't we consume enough protein? Well, one of the reasons we see is digestive issues, such as GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, indigestion. I hear quite often from older folks that they don't like to eat the traditional kinds of proteins, meats, poultry, so on and so forth, because they don't feel good after they eat those kinds of proteins. They get indigestion, their GERD acts up. And so they simply switch over to food that is more comfortable when they digest it, and that's usually carbohydrates. So that's a really major issue, for a major reason for the lack of consumption of proteins. Additionally, as we age, many of us become what we call lactose intolerant, meaning that we can't digest dairy very well. And then that leads to folks not eating and using dairy as one of their protein sources. Dental issues can interfere with protein, eating protein, especially the animal proteins, right? They're a bit harder to chew. And then the same is true for our traditional animal proteins regarding lack of energy to prepare a meal, because those particular types of proteins take a little bit more time and effort, both to cook as well as to procure. Let's take a look at some research and what happens if folks don't eat enough protein. Well, people who consumed the least amount of protein in this one 2018 study that was done on 2,000 seniors were almost twice as likely to have difficulty walking or climbing stairs. Almost twice as likely. That's a big shift. On the other hand, in another study that was done in that same year, those who ate the most protein were 30% less likely to become functionally impaired than those who ate the least amounts. So those are two really serious issues, right? We want to be able to walk. We do not want to be functionally impaired. And we can see that folks who don't eat enough protein will have a much, much greater risk of having that type of decline. Now, you might be wondering, well, how much protein should I eat? And how do I know what I should be eating? I'm going to give you just a quick moment here to figure out approximately how many grams of protein you personally need. If you're physically active, the formula is a little different than if you're not physically active. And if you have poor kidney function, the amount that you have to consume is even lower than if you are physically active or not physically active. For those with poor kidney function, it's very important that you do not go over the recommended intake, and that you go by whatever your physician or your dietitian has recommended for you. But go ahead and just take a quick look at this. So we have 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. If you are physically active, we have a bit of a lower amount, 0.8 to 1.0 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight if you're not that active, and then an even lower amount if you have poor kidney function. Now, I should point out that I am using the European as well as international standards for these recommendations. The American standards are slightly lower, the RDA, they have not adjusted that, but I believe that the higher standards that are used in Europe and are accepted internationally are a better standard. And that's why I'm listing them here, but should you come across other numbers, that is why. So presumably you have figured out approximately how much protein you need. And then the question is, what are good protein? What are proteins, right? What are good protein sources? Not everyone is actually clear on what proteins are. So let's go over them. We have fish, we have poultry, we have meat, we have dairy, eggs. Those are all animal proteins. Then we have tofu or soy. We have now availability of lots of protein shakes or protein powders that can be made either of dairy or of, they're often made of peas, for example. And then we have legumes, beans, lentils, garbanzos. And so the legumes, they have quite a bit of protein. They also contain some starch, but they have quite a bit of protein in them, and they're a very good source of protein for the human body. And then we have nuts and seeds and cheese, but nuts and seeds and cheese, they contain quite a bit of fat. As a matter of fact, they contain more fat than they contain protein. And so you really can't make them your primary protein source, because if you were to do that, you would really overconsume calories in a fashion that would not be good for your body. So the nuts, seeds, and most cheeses are really an add-on protein. They're something that you can use to give yourself a little bit of extra, but don't look toward them as a main source. Keep in mind the number of grams of protein that you need approximately, as we're going to take a look at some charts here that will tell us how much protein is in different kinds of food. You can see in our meat and fish group, certainly our animal proteins contain a lot of protein, right? And like Su Yin said earlier, you have all of that information in the handout if you choose to download that later, if you haven't done so already. So you don't need to write these things down. You don't need to try to remember them. It's all presented for you in the handout. We just want to get a sense, or I want you to get a sense of the fact that it actually takes some effort to get enough protein in your diet. You can see that tofu has also quite a lot of protein, edamame, and then some of things like a boca burger, that's a veggie burger, they're good. Protein drinks tend to have around 16 grams of protein. What I'm talking about here are those ready-made drinks. And then let's take a look at yet some other sources, dairy and eggs. So cottage cheese does not fall in the group of the add-on cheese, if you will, because it's lower in fat and it contains quite a tremendous amount of protein. So that's a good source, as is yogurt. And for those folks who are lactose intolerant, this would be a good time for me to mention that there are many companies now that produce lactose-free dairy. There is, for example, Chobani makes a yogurt that is lactose-free. There is a company called Green Valley that makes yogurt, cottage cheese, as well as cream cheese that are lactose-free. So even those folks who have lactose intolerance issues, they can still consume those kinds of proteins if they want, if they choose the lactose-free versions. Also keep in mind that even our grains contain some proteins, not a whole lot, but enough so to make a difference over the course of a day. What I would like to encourage you to do at home is to just kind of take a look at your actual we call protein intake from the traditional proteins and whatever else you eat to see approximately how close you come to your requirements. And keep in mind that, if say your need is 80 grams of protein, we're not concerned if you're only going to get 65, but we are concerned if you're only going to get 25 grams per day, that is. So to summarize then, what are our take-home points when it comes to protein? Calculate your protein needs and try to meet them. The easiest way to meet your protein needs is to eat some protein with every meal that you have, and try to include more plant protein in your diet, because we do know that doing so has a better overall health outcome than if we get all of our protein needs met by consuming animal-based proteins. So again, the plant proteins would be soy and legumes, as well as some of the protein drinks that are made from pea protein. We are now going to move on to the next nutrient, which is fiber. So why is fiber important? Why do we need fiber? Well, fiber is important for anyone, but it's especially important as we age. What does it do for us? It lowers blood pressure and LDL cholesterol. It prevents constipation and hemorrhoids. It also lessens the severity of diverticulitis and GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. It slows the absorption of sugar and evens out our blood sugar or glucose levels. And with that, it lowers diabetes, dementia, and the risk of Alzheimer's. And we will go more in depth into that one particular aspect of fiber. It also lowers the risk of certain cancers, and it increases satiety. And with that, it will lower the risk of unwanted weight gain, because simply it makes us feel full more quickly than other foods. So what is fiber? Fiber belongs to the carbohydrate group of the macronutrients. Remember, we have 3 of them. We have protein, carbohydrates, and fats, and it comes from plants. We will have to talk here briefly about carbohydrates, because that is the only way in which you will understand what happens to your blood sugar or your glucose levels. There are 3 types of carbohydrates. We have the simple sugars. That would be something like your table sugar. We have starch, which is what's on the inside of a grain. So a white rice kernel or white flour. And then we have fiber, which is the husk of a grain. So for example, brown rice, right? You have the husk, inside would be the starch, but the husk is still intact. And then fiber also comes from vegetable, and actually from all plant matter, also from fruit, not just vegetables. So how does fiber affect glucose? And we will go into as to why this matters in just a little bit. So the starches and the simple sugars, we also call them simple carbs, they raise our blood sugar, or what we call glucose levels, and they can cause a spike in that glucose. Those particular carbs, the simple carbs, have what we call a high glycemic index. And what that means is that they turn into glucose very quickly, which is not favorable to our overall health outcome. And you can see over here on this chart that we have a very steep spike in glucose when we eat those high glycemic index foods. And that is then followed by a very steep drop, which actually goes lower than where we started out from. And that is also not something that your body will like. The high fiber foods, on the other hand, which we call complex carbs, they slow down the conversion of starches to glucose, and they counteract those spikes. So take the brown rice kernel as an example. That fiber on the outside will make that starch turn into glucose less quickly. It will prevent it from turning into glucose quickly. Those high fiber foods, they have what we call a low glycemic index, and they, as you can see over here on our chart on the green, they only raise our glucose levels very gradually, and then those glucose levels will fall gradually. And that's a state that the body prefers, and it's much better for our long-term overall health outcomes. So why are we concerned about this? Why does it matter if we have a spike in glucose? So the problem is that the higher the spike in glucose or blood sugar, the more insulin will be released by the pancreas. So the insulin is there to push the glucose into your cells. That's its function. Over time, those spikes in glucose then lead to overall higher insulin levels. And that in turn leads to a reduction of insulin's effectiveness. So what happens is that suddenly the cells no longer respond as well to the insulin, and they will not absorb the glucose as readily. We call that particular state insulin resistance, which I'm sure is a term that you've heard. We also call it insulin insensitivity. Insulin resistance, insulin insensitivity is what then in turn can lead to the development of type 2 diabetes. So again, we want to avoid the spikes in glucose because we don't want all that insulin released, because if all that insulin is released, the cells will over time no longer respond as well to it, and that is the precursor, if you will, to type 2 diabetes. There's yet another concern regarding glucose spikes, and that is of the effect on our brain. It has been shown that high blood sugar or glucose levels contribute both to momentary and to long-term forgetfulness, dementia, and Alzheimer's. And via that insulin resistance, they also they contribute to the increased risk of dementia. So it's not just the glucose spike itself, but again, the insulin resistance then that also contributes to that increased risk of dementia. Research has shown that chronically high blood sugar levels possibly exert a negative effect on cognition because they change the parts of the brain that are relevant to learning. So again, you know, we don't want these spikes because they are not going to be good both for our body, meaning we may get diabetes over time, and they're not good for our brain. So what are we to do? We want to be eating as much high fiber foods as possible to avoid those spikes. Fruit, vegetable, whole grains, high fiber bran cereals, those are all very good sources. You can see on this the top high fiber food list over here that our legumes are fantastic sources, but many of our vegetables and fruits and grains are as well. And well, what that is in a nutshell means we want to avoid or we want to limit, I should say, we don't need to completely avoid, but we want to limit the intake of what we call simple carbohydrates. So those would be the processed foods and the refined grains. And we want to focus much more so on the complex carbohydrates, the whole grains, the vegetables, and the fruit. That will help us keep our blood sugar levels more even and reduce the risks that I just mentioned. We also really want to avoid what we call added sugars. So added sugars are something that is added to a food that has been produced. It's not what is inside of a fruit, for example, but it's something that, for example, has been added to your yogurt, right? So a plain yogurt contains around 6 grams of protein of sugar, whereas it contains upward of 20 grams of sugar when it's a fruit yogurt. Some of them contain 30 grams of sugar. So with one such yogurt, you would already go over the recommended amount. We certainly want to stay away from consuming sugars that come from drinks. In summary, regarding fiber, these are our take-home points. We want to get approximately 25 to 35 grams of fiber. And I forgot to mention one important thing, and that is that only about 5% of the American population eats that much, meets those recommendations. So that's a pretty measly number of people, right? So you really don't want to be in that 95 group that doesn't consume enough fiber. The easiest way to do that is by choosing whole grains over refined grains, by eating plenty of vegetables and fruit. And then yet another important point to avoid those glucose spikes. We want to limit our added sugars to approximately 25 grams per day, if possible, right? Let's move on to hydration. So why would that be of importance? Why would we be concerned about hydration? Well, the effects of dehydration can be quite serious. They range from the annoying, like fatigue and headaches, to weakness and more dizziness, increased risk of falling. Constipation is one of the first things that happens when you're not consuming enough fluids. Dehydration can cause confusion. I have personally known of a number of folks whose parents were admitted to the ER because of confusion, and it turned out that they were simply dehydrated. Visual disturbances, but most disconcerting and serious, the risk of bladder and kidney infections. So it appears as though as we age, when we have a bladder infection, the symptoms are no longer as strong as when we are younger, which then means that they often go undiscovered. And when a bladder infection goes undiscovered, it can rise to the kidneys, and that can turn fatal in a very short period of time, in a matter of a couple of days, if it's not treated. So clearly, this is not something that you want to be risking. In older adults, dehydration is one of those very often unrecognized causes of hospitalization, morbidity, and mortality. Why do we get dehydrated? Well, the primary reason is that our thirst sensors diminish. They no longer function as properly, and so they will no longer tell us that we need to consume fluids. That's a bit of a problem, right? Medications, caffeine, and alcohol can lead to dehydration. And then some folks don't consume enough fluids because they have a fear of incontinence, or even more simply, they may not be as mobile and they don't feel like they want to have to go to the bathroom to pee all the time. That's something I hear quite frequently. Oh, I don't want to have to pee all the time. Well, you know, like I said, the consequences are rather serious. Our recommended amounts still are, I'm sure you folks have all heard that, it's somewhere around the 8 cups of 8 ounces per day. But if you want to figure out more in detail where you fall, you have a daily water chart here to compare your needs to. Also keep in mind that this is the 8 times 8 ounces is when we are not sweating. So if you are sweating because it's a very hot day and you're outdoors, or because you're exercising, you need to increase the amount of water that you consume. Now, because your thirst sensors are diminished, you really are best off monitoring your fluid intake. And one really easy way to do that is by getting yourself a water bottle that looks like this one, which, by the way, they're available just about everywhere nowadays. And this is a 32-ounce bottle, and the idea here is that you are following the prompts on the bottle, right? You get started at 8 a.m. and then you refill it at 1 p.m. and you finish around 7 p.m. And that's a good guideline, because that means that if you finish your water intake around that time, that you are not likely to have to get up all night long, right? Whereas if you end up, drinking most of your fluids after that time, then you definitely will be getting up, and obviously none of us really like that. So this is a great tool to help you stay on track when it comes to your fluid intake. Our take-home points are: monitor your fluid intake, drink your fluids early in the day, and aim for approximately 8 8-ounce glasses per day. Now we're going to move on finally to the micronutrients. So again, we are mostly concerned, or these are of the greatest concern, are iron, vitamin B12, vitamin D, folate, zinc, calcium, and biotin. Here are some of the reasons for micronutrient malnutrition. Age-related malabsorption, and we'll go into all of these and I'll explain more how that works and what we can do about it. Age-related malabsorption, medication-related depletion, alcohol-related depletion, lack of intake, or lack of production within the body, which we call synthesis. We will begin with age-related malabsorption issues. So inside of your stomach walls, you have what we call gastric acid cells. And those cells, they produce the gastric acid as well as some other components that are necessary for digestion. Those particular acids and components, they break down your food so that the body can then absorb the nutrients from it. As we age, the number of those cells decline. Additionally, we also need something called enzymes to break down our food. Enzymes are components that are produced by your pancreas, and they too are there to break down the molecules from the food that you eat and make them, if you will, this is a really simplified way of explaining it. They make the molecules small enough so that they can enter through the lining of your small intestine and go into your bloodstream and then be distributed throughout the entire body, where they get used for all those many different biochemical processes that take place in there all day long and all night long. By the way, we absorb nutrients through the small intestine, not through the stomach. So that's where the fact that the lining of the small intestine also changes as we age and doesn't allow as well for the absorption to take place, that also comes in as one of the reasons. So we have both declining gastric acid cells, we have decreased enzyme production, and we have a change in the lining of the small intestine. And all of those changes then they lead, and again, this is a natural process, they lead to most of the nutrients that I mentioned being affected by that malabsorption, with the exception of vitamin D. So those nutrients that are chiefly affected by these malabsorption issues are B12, folic acid, biotin, zinc, calcium, and iron. Again, why are we concerned about that? What are the consequences? So the effect of malabsorption that are disconcerting, and I find mostly iron and, or not mostly, but iron and B12 are really of the greatest concern, because both of them, if we are deficient, our body will end up with a form of anemia. There are two different kinds of forms of anemia that are affected by iron and B12, but both forms of anemia can turn, in turn lead to memory loss, delusion, personality changes, excessive fatigue, depression, infection, as well as neuropathy. Now, approximately 20% of folks over 60 are deficient in B12. And when that deficiency becomes severe enough, the delusion and the memory loss and the personality changes can become pronounced enough that a person can be misdiagnosed with dementia, which is a very tragic outcome, given that all this person needs is to be supplemented or to get vitamin B12 shots or be supplemented with B12 or iron, right? So very, very serious consequences if the deficiency gets to the point where it's severe. We are also concerned about the bone loss and osteoporosis that come with calcium deficiency, as well as the poor immunity, poor wound healing, and neuropathy that come from a zinc deficiency. Folic acid also can lead to memory loss. It's usually not quite as pronounced as from iron and B12, but nevertheless serious enough to pay attention to, as well as it can lead to depression. And then it can increase what are called our homocysteine levels, and with that, our stroke risk. Biotin, our main concerns are muscle pain and fatigue. So those are serious enough concerns that we want to pay attention to. Now, I will go over all the different absorption or micronutrient deficiency issues, and then I will explain to you what we can do about it. many folks as we age, are on medications, and medications can interfere both with absorption as well as they can deplete the body of those nutrients when they get broken down and metabolized in our body. I am highlighting here again the nutrients that we discussed that we are also at risk of malabsorption. So if you're already not absorbing them well, and then you're on a drug like this, you're getting a double whammy, right? You're not absorbing them well for two reasons now, or not getting enough of them for two reasons. So we really need to pay attention to that. Blood pressure drugs, ACE inhibitors, they affect zinc. Beta blockers affect zinc as well as sodium, potassium, magnesium, B1, B6, and vitamin C. Diuretics affect zinc, calcium, vitamin D, also magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, and CoQ10, which is called coenzyme Q10. Statins deplete the body of vitamin D and calcium, and also of coenzyme Q10. And just on a side note here, the depletion of coenzyme Q10 from statins is quite serious, and it can lead to poor health outcomes. So if you are on a statin, please speak to your physician or your pharmacist or a nutritionist, because that particular nutrient should be then supplemented with. But speak to someone knowledgeable about that before you decide to take it on your own. Acid suppressing drugs, such as the proton pump inhibitors, PPIs, they deplete the body of B12. H2 antagonists, we're concerned about iron, B12, folic acid, calcium, vitamin D. And then folks who are on oral diabetes medications, they will absorb less B12 and folic acid. Now let's take a look and see what alcohol does. So alcohol is a tricky one, right? Because we know that there are some aspects of health that can potentially improve if we have some amount of alcohol, but we really need to be within the guidelines. And the guidelines are, for women, it's 1 drink per day, and for men, it's 2 drinks per day. It also, though, depends on your body size. So don't just go with those recommendations. If you're a small person, you should definitely go with the lower recommendation. What's 1 drink? 5 ounces of wine, 12 ounces of beer, 1.5 ounces of a distilled spirit. Folks who consume more are at risk of zinc, B12, folic acid, calcium, magnesium, B1, and vitamin C deficiency. And sometimes we also see an impact on overall calories that's negative, as well as it can lead to protein deficiency. So don't overdo it, is the take-home message here. So what are we to do again? Oh, well, actually, we'll talk about one more thing, and then we'll talk about what to do about it. So I'm going to bring up here a different nutrient that I haven't addressed before, and that's omega-3 fatty acids. And the main reason there are 2 reasons why I'm bringing this nutrient here into the discussion. And one of it is because I get asked about it all the time. So I thought I might as well just bring it up on my own. So omega-3 fatty acids, some people call them fish oil, right? That's what many folks know them as. Omega-3 fatty acids are what we call essential fatty acids. Anytime we use the term essential in connection with the human body, that means that the body cannot make the nutrient on its own, and that we have to consume it from food. That's the only way we can get it, is from food. So most Americans don't eat enough fish, which is largely where we get our omega-3 fatty acids from, to meet the recommended amount. And omega-3 fatty acids are really critical for brain health, which is my main reason for bringing this into this discussion. We have seen that folks who consume adequate amounts of omega-3 fatty acids have a much lower risk of developing Alzheimer's. We also now see that those who take a supplement, so EPA and DHA, which you can see at the bottom here on this list, Those are the two active components of fish oil. They're the two components that are the ones that will make a difference in your body, if you will. And we have now some studies that have shown that when a person has mild cognitive impairment and supplements with EPA and DHA, with fish oil, that there is some favorable improvement. And by the way, wherever you see the little number after the text that I've put into the slideshow, that's something that you will find a reference to at the very end of the handout that you are given. So if this is something that you want to look into more, or you're interested in the research behind it, that's how you will find the research related to the particular statement that I've made. All that is to say, you can see that for your brain, it certainly is good to eat lots of fish, fatty fish especially, and potentially to be taking a omega-3 fatty acid supplement. Vitamin D is a different character, if you will, because we cannot get enough vitamin D from the food. There's simply not enough food sources that contain large enough amounts of vitamin D that we can rely on it to get our vitamin D needs met. The human body manufactures vitamin D, it synthesizes it when we're exposed to sunlight. But unfortunately, like everything else with the human body, as we age, its ability to do that declines. And then, of course, in addition to that ability declining, all of us, or most of us anyway, we wear sunscreen when we go out, which is a good thing, right? We don't want to get skin cancer. But the sunscreen also blocks the rays needed for vitamin D production. A very large number of people over 60, 40% of people over 60 are deficient in vitamin D, and they don't know it. And that's a real concern, because the risk factors of low vitamin D levels are quite serious. Muscle and bone loss, I'm sure you're aware of that. Increased risk of fracture. Very interesting, also increased risk of falling. That has been shown by research. Increased risk of depression and greater infection risk. And you might find this interesting. COVID-19 outcomes have shown to be much worse in those that are deficient in vitamin D. We also see an accelerated cognitive decline and then increase in some cancers when if a person has low vitamin D levels. So now, finally, what are we supposed to do about all this? Well, there are some nutrients that we can actually test for. We can see how much of those nutrients are, if you will, contained in our body, right? We have vitamin D, vitamin B12, folic acid, B9, and then in terms of our iron levels, iron and ferritin. So the reason why you will want to ask your physician to run this test is as follows. I get asked a lot, why shouldn't can I just take a vitamin D? Yes, you could, but here is the thing. There is what we call a government, an RDA, a recommended daily allowance for vitamin D, which is what in vitamin D, we're not talking grams, we're talking international units, or IU. So vitamin D has an IU of 2,000. That's the government recommended daily intake. Now, say you are within the normal range of vitamin D, and you are a little bit, you're in that normal range, but you want to bring it up just a little bit. So just so that you're more in the middle and you're really protected by having enough vitamin D on board. In that case, the 2,000 international units would probably be great for you. But if you're really far below what's normal, then it would take much, much too much time for you to get up to a level that is adequate, during which time you're then at risk of all of those issues that we discussed before, right? So we then need to have a higher amount. Now, why wouldn't we just start with the higher amount without knowing where your level's at? Well, some nutrients, and vitamin D happens to be one of them, iron is another one, by the way, will build up in your body and become toxic if you take too much of it. So if you decide to go out on your own and you say, oh, I'm going to take 5,000 because more is better, that may not be good for you because you may get into the toxic range, right? But if you only take 2,000, it may not be enough for you to get into the normal range. That's why we want to start out with measuring the levels so that we can scientifically ascertain how much you need. We would then put you on a certain amount to get you to normal. And once you're at normal, we put you on what we call a maintenance dose so that we can maintain normal, right? One word about iron and ferritin, that's the name of the tests that you will want to ask for. They are not routinely run as part of the blood tests that physicians do. Most physicians run what we call a CBC, a complete blood cell count. And the only thing we see there is the amount of iron that's currently in our blood. But what we really want to know is how much iron you have stored, because that's where we first see concerns of anemia. We will last see it in your blood and first in your iron storage. Ferritin and iron, those two tests will look at storage as opposed to just what's in your bloodstream. Much more accurate, much better for prevention. We don't want to wait until you see it in the bloodstream because then you're full-fledged anemic and you really don't need to put your body through that. So ask for these tests. Health insurance should pay for that. And then you can adequately supplement after getting the information. Now, speaking of supplements, so, you know, lots of folks go out there and they buy supplements because they've read something about it or they have had a friend tell them about it. And they never think about the fact that maybe there could be a contraindication between their supplement and medications they're on. Because after all, supplements are over the counter, right? But that doesn't mean that there can't be an issue when you're taking them alongside of a medication. So you really would need to speak to your physician or a pharmacist or a nutritionist who can check your medications up against the supplements you want to be taking. And, you know, maybe your medication amount, or rather the dosage has to be adjusted. Like say if you're on a blood thinner and you want to take a fish oil, your physician can adjust the dosage, right? Both of them thin the blood, so you don't want to take both of them together without having your physician know about that. By all means, if you are deficient, if your blood tests show that you should be supplementing, you should also supplement if your medications deplete the body of nutrients. But again, you have to speak to your pharmacist, physician, or nutritionist about it before doing that on your own to avoid creating a situation that can be dangerous for your body. All that said, multivitamins, a high quality multivitamin is often something that works quite well. You, by all means, consider an omega-3 fish oil. Those things really can improve your nutritional status. Our take-home points here are: get your vitamin D, B12, folic acid, iron, and ferritin levels tested. Talk to your doctor, nutritionist, or a pharmacist before starting a new supplement routine. Limit your alcohol consumption, and then consume a balanced diet. So, what is a balanced diet? We're finally getting to the food, right? What should you eat? What should I eat? Well, I have always really loved this quote by Hippocrates: let food be your medicine, and medicine be your food. So take one of those tomatoes and a cucumber with your cabbage and you will be just fine. So I know that all of you are familiar with the food pyramid, and the food pyramid's okay, but it's cumbersome. And lucky for us, we now have a new way of looking at how we can best eat that is much, much simpler and really quite wonderful as far as I'm concerned. It's called the plate method. So when we follow the plate method, and I'm going to go more in depth into that, you will get all the nutrients that you need. You will meet your calorie needs. You will, from the vegetable portion, get many of your micronutrients, your vitamins and minerals. You will get all the fiber you need from that portion. You will get from the protein and healthy fat portion all of those nutrients, as well as from the carbohydrate portion, the ones that you need in that regard. So let me explain. This doesn't mean that you're going to have at one meal a chicken and fish and cheese and avocados and a pork loin, right? These are simply examples. So when we're looking at this, visualize a plate, cut it in half, and in your mind's eye, fill it half with vegetables. Ideally, our lunches and dinners would look like that. Then a quarter of that plate will be filled with the proteins. So that also, by the way, and which we don't have on here, unfortunately, would include tofu, right? Or any other kind of soy product. But this is where we would find our healthy proteins and then also some of our fats. Over here in the other segment, the other quarter, we will find our carbohydrates. So our grains, our corn, and also fruit actually falls into that because they're higher in carbohydrates than vegetables. And then our sweet potatoes, so on and so forth. Here are some really lovely examples. So we have our vegetables with our scallops or brown rice. We have our green beans with our chicken and our corn. We have our tuna with our bread and our vegetable salad. Our beef with our brown rice and our Brussels sprouts. Our eggs with our potatoes and our asparagus. Our vegetable salad with the shrimp and the garbanzo beans. Now, I'm sure you all know now that the garbanzos actually should partially go into that protein section, right? Because they also contain proteins. They contain proteins and starches. So the person who put together this picture didn't quite do that properly. But these are some great ways in which you can create a very, very balanced nutritional food intake for yourself. Now, you may say, this looks like way too much work. I'm never going to pull that one off. Well, I got good news for you, because now we can get lots of really great food that is frozen that can be a good starting point for such a going with the plate method. These really are good quality products. Some of them are from Trader Joe's, some of them are from other stores. As you go out there, you will see there's lots of this now available. What we're basically looking for when there's a grain is a whole grain. We're looking for a protein always in there, right? So here we have our peas, for example. Here we have our tofu. Here we have beef. Here we have chicken, more chicken. And then we also can have separate components. So for example, canned beans are a great and very easy, quick way to get your proteins. Frozen brown rice, easy way to get your whole grain. Trader Joe's carries that. They also have frozen quinoa, by the way. They have this lovely multi-grain vegetable mix that's frozen. And then on here also, you will see a protein drink. This particular kind by Orgain is really high quality. It's much improved over, for example, something like Ensure. And it can really be used as a way in which you can increase your protein intake with a lot of ease. This is, something you can have with your breakfast or as a snack. They're quite tasty. Like I said, good quality, organic. They come both in made from pea protein, as well as there's one that's made from whey, excuse me, or dairy rather. So those are some great options. But the one thing that I will say that is lacking here is enough vegetables. So you will have to add some vegetables, maybe a salad, a bowl of cherry tomatoes, something steamed. It doesn't have to be complicated, but you will have to add some vegetables. And I'm going to underline that a little more here with the vegetables. I imagine that many of you read the study, or at least the headlines that came out last week. There was a study that was published in the journal called of Circulation by the AMA. And it followed in the US alone, it was actually worldwide, but in the US, over 100,000 participants over the course of 5 years. And what was found was the magic bullet, really. If you have a daily intake of 2 servings of fruit and 3 servings of vegetables, that is associated with a decreased risk of all-cause mortality and increased longevity. So all-cause mortality, meaning that the risk of dying from any cause was reduced when people ate 2 servings of fruit and 3 servings of vegetables per day. This is really amazing, right? Because it's not hard. This is your food as medicine. This is your fountain of youth right here. And yet, and that's a bit of a sad statistic, in this nationwide survey of over 70,000 adults over 65, it was found that quite a small amount ate enough vegetables. So don't be part of that group that misses out on this wonderful and longevity creating nutrients that come from fruits and vegetables. Servings, what's a serving? So a half a cup of raw or cooked vegetables, and here raw would be firm vegetables. So like carrots, cucumbers, green beans, well, you don't eat them raw. Tomatoes, that would be the raw ones. When we're looking at leafy greens, the soft ones, then 1 serving is a full cup. A half a cup of fruit is a full serving, or a medium, approximately baseball-sized piece of fruit, like an apple, an orange, a peach, something of that nature. So what is our take-home point? What are our take-home points here for nutritional choices? Follow the plate method. Eat 3 servings of vegetables per day. Eat 2 servings of fruit per day, and frozen and canned foods are perfectly fine options. Finally, if there are only 4 points that you take home from this presentation that you remember and that you do something about: eating your vegetables, eat enough protein, drink enough water, and get your micronutrients tested. This will really make a big difference for you and your overall health and contribute to much better, much healthier aging. And with that, we are going to move over to the Q&A segment of the presentation. We have quite a bit of time left, which is great. And I'm handing this over to Sigrid.
Hello, everybody. That was really super interesting. And yeah, I mean, you always think you know a lot, but then you see something like that and you actually realize you don't. So yeah, there are quite a few questions. And it actually started, the first questions were mostly about people were a little bit confused about the gram and the ounce conversion. And I know about that. I mean,
Yes.
so, for example, there was one question: many of us are less than 150 pounds. How much protein does a 130-pound person need with moderate exercise? So
okay, so I'm gonna have to pull out my calculator, right? So first of all, we have to figure out 130 pounds divided by 2.2. That's about 59 kilos. And then we're going to multiply that by, was this a person who does not exercise?
moderate exercise.
Moderate exercise. Okay, so then we would go with approximately times 1, which would bring you to around about, we'll say about 60 grams of protein. Yeah, so basically here's what you do. You divide the amount that you weigh in pounds by 2.2, okay? And then you multiply that by what's on there. So with the moderate exercise, I would say, you know, we're not going to need to go all the way to 1.2. You could go to 1.1, but somewhere in that realm. Does that make sense?
It does.
Good. Yeah.
So then there were two questions about the FODMAP diet. Do you have any advice for those of us on a low FODMAP diet?
Okay, a low FODMAP diet. Okay, so the low FODMAP diet is a diet that's specific to particular types of digestive issues, right? And so a person who is on a low FODMAP diet has to avoid certain kinds of vegetables and fruit because of what they have a high fructose content. So what I would recommend for you, if that's the case, you really have to pay attention to eating enough of the vegetables that you can get from all the sources that are not on that list. That's really a very good question, actually, because lots of people who are on the FODMAP diet will not consume enough plant food as a result. If hopefully if you're on that diet, you will have been given a list of the vegetables and fruit that does not fall on it, as well as one that falls on it, and make sure that you are still meeting that three servings of vegetable and 2 servings of fruit every day. And if your digestive issues are severe enough not to be able to take any fruit, then you will need to make up for that by having more vegetables on board.
Thank you. Then the next question was, does the 64-ounce goal for fluid consumption include fluid from foods?
That's a very good question, and it does not. And the reason why is because while we get some fluids from food, it's very difficult to ascertain how much exactly. And so the guidelines have essentially left that out, even though we get some of it from our fruits and vegetables largely, right? But it's just not quite enough to make up for it.
And there was also a question about how much do you estimate we need to actually drink, and how does this vary by body weight? I think it was on some of your slides.
Yes, it is on some of the slides. So, but here is a really good way to know whether or not you are not drinking enough. And that is, you're going to take a look at the color of your pee, okay? So if your pee is light yellow, then you're doing a good job. If it's totally clear, you're drinking too much, which also is not a good thing, because that can lead to issues with your what we call electrolytes, which are the things that help your heartbeat. So we don't want to do that. So you don't want to have urine that's completely crystal clear, right? You want to have it have a light yellow color. As soon as it gets a little bit darker yellow or more, pronounced yellow, then you're probably not drinking enough. Now, one thing to be said about that, though, is if you're taking a multivitamin, which has a vitamin in it called B3, that will turn your urine bright yellow neon color, but that's usually just in 1 or 2 times of going to the bathroom after you've taken your vitamin. So later in the day, it will no longer have that bright color. So don't be worried about that. That's a normal part of taking a multivitamin. But that's really, a very easy way to see what's going on.
The next is actually a comment, but I think it's really interesting because you read a lot about it in the newspapers. Any alcohol increases the chance of cancer, according to an international study.
That's right.
By the Gates Foundation. And so I thought I'd read that because it's often in the newspapers nowadays that, that one glass, yeah, but.
That's right. That's exactly right. So, nutritional science is interesting, right? Because it's for one thing, it's in many ways still in its infancy, and we constantly learn new things. And yes, in this last year, the research has shown that any type of alcohol does indeed increase our cancer risk. Now, also keep in mind, alcohol is what we call a neurotoxin. So it's really not good for your brain, right? The one thing where we think of alcohol as a potential for, as a health benefit, if you will, is that it will, especially red wine, will make our blood vessels less stiff, and it will relax us enough that it will bring blood pressure down. But I personally think that you are best off to, if I were to advise you personally, I would say don't drink more than a couple times a week, because with what we're finding out, it's just not a good idea. So yeah, thank you for that comment. Very good.
And then another comment was actually the fish, which fish matters. I think it was Al, yeah, he mentioned herring, salmon, sardines, mackerel are better than the white fish. So I assume.
Thank you. That is correct. And thank you for that comment also. Also, when we talk about fish, we want to pay attention to mercury content, right? So for example, swordfish is one of the fish that's the highest. So we want to pay attention to that. We don't want to have a high intake of that. But yes, thank you for that comment.
So here's a question about multivitamins. What is a high quality multivitamin and how do you know?
Right.
On the price of it?
No, that's a very good question. You're going to take a look at the ingredients on the back, and not what I'm talking about here is not the amounts of the vitamin, but where it says ingredient, colon, and then it will give you all the other stuff that's in there. If your multivitamin contains a lot of binders and starches and food colorings, it's a low quality multivitamin. So that's really the best way to know. You really don't want to, as you probably know, there are some concerns regarding especially food coloring, right? So in Europe, a lot of the food colorings that are still allowed here are no longer allowed because they're neurotoxins. And yet, lots of the more commonly produced multivitamins, they put food coloring into it. And so that's really not what you want to be taking when you're trying to take care of your health. So that's the best way to know that. So it's not just price, but that's how you can ascertain that.
So the next question, if absorption is a problem, aren't supplements a waste since we won't absorb them any more than we do from food?
That is also a very good question. So well, first of all, we won't, right, necessarily absorb them more, with the exception, for example, of vitamin B12. And so here is something that's interesting about B12. B12 requires a particular component of the gastric acid called intrinsic factor. That intrinsic factor literally cleaves the B12 from, which mostly comes from animal protein. It cleaves it from the meat, the chicken that you're eating, be absorbed. Without that intrinsic to digest it from our supplement from B12. With the other ones, it's more of you're getting a much more higher dosage, right, that than you would be able to ever get from the food that you eat. So you can't, well, first of all, vitamin D doesn't fall into it either, but let's talk about iron, right? So if you're not absorbing that much iron from food, if you were to try to get up your milligrams enough to absorb enough, then you'd have to be eating a lot more animal protein, and that wouldn't bode well for your overall health, nor could you eat that much. So it's an assurance that you're getting a higher amount, out of which then between the food and the supplements, you will be getting enough altogether so that you come up to a normal level.
So here's a question about a non-fat diet. What about getting enough protein when you are on a non-fat diet due to gallstones?
Yes, so that is also a very good question. And I would say this is where animal proteins come in. So for example, tofu doesn't contain a lot of fat. Many of our protein shakes and protein drinks are not containing fat. So that would really be something that one would want to gravitate toward, or non-fat dairy. The non-fat dairy is actually quite high in protein, and that would be a good source of a protein for that particular person.
Then there was someone interested in your thoughts of benefits of coconut oil.
Ooh, yeah, that's a complicated one. So, okay, I will just give you this in a nutshell. So coconut oil is different from other oils in that it does contain saturated fat, which other plant fats do not contain, and but it's in a different format than the saturated fat that comes from otherwise our animal fats or animal proteins. Now, for quite a long time, we thought that coconut oil had actually a beneficial effect on, for example, cardiovascular disease. But here's what you have to know about nutritional science. You know, obviously you can't isolate a human or and put them into an environment where nothing else influences them, right? So anytime you're talking nutritional science, you have a lot of factors playing into it. And a lot of the research that is done nutritionally is epidemiology type of research. So where populations are studied, and the populations that were studied for the coconut oil regarding its effect on heart disease were all islanders, because that is where the coconuts naturally grow, and those folks were consuming lots of coconut and coconut fat. But here's the problem: they're islanders, and they were also consuming tremendous amounts of fish. So now the issue is that we don't really know, is their heart health good because indeed the coconut oil is contributing to it, or is it good because they're eating lots of fish, and by the way, also lots of fiber that comes from tubers and things that grow in those regions, right? And the fiber then also lowers the cholesterol. So there are just too many factors playing into it. And what I would recommend here is that if you have an interest in using coconut oil, by all means do so, but don't overdo the amount, because we really don't, the story, you know, yeah, is not that clear. And yeah, I hope that makes sense. The jury's still out.
Then somebody asked, where can you buy water lentil duckweed powder? This is a great protein source for vegans.
I don't know is the answer. I haven't got the slightest clue.
Good. Okay, then what about, or how about dehydrated fruits or vegetables?
Very good question. So, you know, whenever you dehydrate something, the sugar content goes up, right? Because now you have no, it's not at all balanced out by the water in that particular product. So dehydrated fruit, consume it in small amounts, and don't consume. So I'll give you an example. I've worked with someone who was a vegan and was trying very hard to eat very healthy. And for his breakfast, he had oats, and he had lots and lots of dried fruit in it. About half of it was raisins and the other half was oats. And this wasn't the only reason, but anyway, this gentleman ended up being pre-diabetic, because here's what happens if you eat that much dried fruit. You're going to create that sugar spike that we were talking about that you want to be avoiding, right? So dried fruit in small amounts as part of a trail mix, or, you know, like I love eating a couple of figs after my dinner because it's a nice sweet treat, if you will. That's great, but don't eat them like you were to eat regular fruit. And then dried vegetables, really, I mean, it depends on what they are, right? Most people don't eat them just like that, because usually it's something like sun-dried tomatoes or something of that nature, which we add to cooking. I doubt that anyone would really overconsume that.
And here's a question about how about drinking tea all day? I don't seem to drink water. Love tea with ginger.
Okay, so it depends on the kind of tea. So me being from Switzerland, we have a very big tradition of drinking herbal tea. I drink tea all day also, but it's herbal tea. If you're just drinking black tea, then that's not the best choice. But if you're even drinking green tea, you know, that's certainly better than just drinking black tea. But ideally, just drink lots and lots of herbal tea, or make your ginger tea with just the ginger, maybe some lemon and water. That's great. So when we're talking beverages, by the way, what we're looking at is anything that's not sweetened, right? So even if you have like a glass of soy milk, that would contribute to your fluid intake. But by the way, we're also no longer recommending fruit juices, because we now know that they actually have the same detrimental effect on our liver as sodas. So unfortunately, those are out unless it's in small amounts. So the fluids and vegetable juices, because they're mostly based on having carrot in it, which is very sweet, are also not the best choice. So unsweetened fluids is what we're looking for, and not caffeine.
Yeah. Yeah, somebody asked, I read that drinking water with lemon will help with your acid alkaline balance. Is that good for you?
So first of all, you know, the human body is a really magical biochemistry machine, and it will definitely balance your alkaline and your acid without you doing anything, which is the good news, because otherwise some people would be in trouble, right? But there are foods that are more alkalinic and some are more acidic. And that's, by the way, doesn't have to do with how a food tastes. So alkaline is largely vegetables and fruit, and lemon falls into that, even though it tastes acidic, right? And then acidic foods are more like the refined carbohydrate type of things. Yes, it will. Drinking lemon water is great, and you will contribute to a good balance in your body. But like I said, your body will do that great job even on if you don't drink your lemon water.
Here, another comment. A well-known nutritionist in Berkeley told me that a cup of coffee is considered part of your 64 ounces of water because it is, after all, water. That doesn't sound right to me.
Okay, so that's also, and I was thinking that question would probably come up. So this is another interesting one, because when they do actual research on coffee, it doesn't seem to have a dehydrating effect on the human body, which is why some nutritionists are changing that guideline. But anytime they do any kind of studies of where they actually look at the experience of people, it appears as though people get thirsty from drinking caffeinated beverages. So here's what I'm going to tell you is that if you're not the kind of person that notices that, and you know, I still wouldn't recommend that be your main beverage, or that wouldn't bode well in other ways. But then by all means count it. If you're the kind of person who, when you have a cup of coffee, you feel kind of dry and thirsty afterward, then add the water. Now, here comes the problem with the thirst sensors, right, that are diminished. So to stay on the safe side, this is what the Italians do. And this is what I think, it's a good historic way of consuming coffee that we all should follow. Anytime you go into a traditional cafe or restaurant in Italy and you order a coffee, whether it's an espresso or a cappuccino, they give you a small glass of water alongside with it. Do the same thing, and you know, trust that tradition. That's my recommendation. But yes, that is where that comes from. So it's not that she was wrong at all. It's just that this recommendation is a bit challenging because of where the science and versus the experience falls.
So what are problems with the colon absorbing or not absorbing sufficient water?
So the colon, okay, so I'm not quite sure what that person is wanting to know, but so the colon, so here, so first of all, we have two parts, right? We have the small intestine, and then we have the large intestine. The large intestine is the colon, right? So the colon, when we digest food in our stomach, it becomes a soupy mix. It's called chyme. It goes into the small intestine. In your small intestine, the body will withdraw nutrients from it. Then it goes into your large intestine. It's still very liquidy, if you will. The body then absorbs fluids from it and makes stool, which is more firm. So I'm going to guess at what this person's wanting to know. So I assume that what this person wants to know is, why is the body not absorbing enough so that my stool is firm, as opposed to, for example, being diarrhea, right? So the diarrhea is when you have too much liquid in your stool. The body has not absorbed enough. So my answer is, it really depends. It could be because of an bacterial infection that is the cause. It could be that the stool is too loose or too liquidy if the person takes too much magnesium, specifically magnesium citrate, because magnesium actually draws fluids to your colon, which is great for folks who have stools that are too hard, right? But if you're taking too much magnesium or the wrong kind, it can even be the recommended amount, but the wrong type, it will draw so much fluid into your colon that now your stool gets very, very loose. So those would be the two most common reasons. And if you do indeed have that problem and you're not on magnesium, then you should talk to your physician about it, because there's something else that's not working properly. That should not happen. The body should know how much fluids to absorb, and it will do so unless there's something not quite right.
How do you view the sugar in raw honey?
Okay, very good question. So honey has lots of wonderful benefits. I myself have a beehive up buzzing around. Up often we have bees. And yet it's a sugar. But the difference is that it contains some other components, minerals, for example, that are very good for us. It's still a sugar, so it still should be consumed with caution, right? But it can also be consumed as medicine. So you don't want to sweeten your tea with lots of sugar because it is a sugar, but you can use it, for example, when you have a cough or when you have a sore throat, having a little keeping in your mouth so that it can coat your throat can work wonders for a cough and for a sore throat. It can even, I have asthma, it can even help with asthma attacks. So it's a great, great nutrient.
Not sure. I didn't hear the last thing.
Suying, are we having an issue?
No.
Yeah, you're back, Saskia. You cut out for a little bit.
Okay. Do I need to repeat something?
I think that we got the gist of it, right?
Okay.
I mean, so okay. There was something else about honey. I mean, another question about honey. But you almost answered it already. So how about honey in the tea and maple syrup on yogurt? Is that sugar?
It is sugar, exactly. So it counts as sugar. You know, it's not that you shouldn't have any kind of sugar, right? But here's what you don't want. You don't want to have what we would say consume sugar by itself. So for example, if you are consuming a bunch of white flour cookies with sugar in them, right? There's no fiber present, there's no protein present, and that will make your blood sugar level spike. But if you're having a little bit of sugar, or not sugar, but like in this case, maple syrup on your yogurt, then the protein will prevent you from having a blood sugar spike, as long as the amount of the maple syrup you're putting on your yogurt is not too high. So my guideline with yogurt is that don't go over, so the yogurt itself contains, because lactose is a sugar, right? So dairy naturally contains sugar. Don't go over 10 grams altogether. So even if you find a fruit yogurt that's somewhere under, up to 10 grams of sugar, that's still okay. But anything above that is going to be too much. So if you have a little drizzle on that, or you have a small amount of honey in your tea, you're going to be just fine.
Then there was a question about kombucha. What about kombucha not homemade?
Okay, so that's a very good question regarding sugar, because most kombucha is really high in sugar because they put lots of sugar in there, and it's actually not good for you. Okay. Because of that, not because of, what the fermentation does, but because of the high sugar amount.
But when you make it yourself, I actually make kombucha. Yeah. So you can somewhat regulate the sugar.
Correct.
I mean, the sugar because of the fungus. I mean, yeah.
That's right. Exactly. So they need some sugar because of the fermentation process, obviously. But you can regulate it. There are some that are on the market that you want to read your ingredient list there and look at your grams of sugar. And then also I recommend don't drink it by itself, because again, if you have something like that while you're having a meal, and your fiber and your protein are going to buffer that spike in glucose, that's really different than if you have it, like say first thing in the morning and then you're not eating for 2 hours, then you're going to create a glucose spike.
Then there was a question about farmed salmon. What about farmed salmon? Is it better than no salmon?
Wait, I didn't quite understand that.
I think the question is, I mean, there's obviously the wild salmon and there's the farmed.
The farmed salmon. Okay. Yes.
Better to have that, I mean, the farmed salmon than no salmon at all.
Okay, so that's a very, very good question. So salmon, the reason why it's a healthy food for us is because it's rich in omega-3 fatty acids, right? So that's what we discussed earlier. Now, the way the salmon becomes rich in omega-3 fatty acids is by eating plankton and algae. That is how it gets its omega-3 fatty acid content. When salmon is farmed, it depends on how it's farmed. Lots of salmon is farmed by feeding it corn and not what it's used to be eating, which is plankton and algae. Now, if the salmon is fed with corn, it does not get to be rich in omega-3 fatty acids, but rather it becomes rich in omega-6 fatty acids. The problem with our diet in the US is that we already consume too many omega-6 fatty acids. So omega-6 fatty acids have an inflammatory effect on the human body. They lead to the production of a hormone-like substance that's pro-inflammatory. Now, inflammation is important for your immune system, but you don't want to overdo it, right? Omega-3 fatty acids, on the other hand, they lead to the production of a hormone-like substance that's anti-inflammatory. So first of all, if you buy farmed salmon, you have to find out what was it fed. Now there are some places where we'll say it was fed plankton. That makes it a better salmon. But the other thing you need to know about the farmed salmon that's been fed the corn is that the reason why your salmon has that coral orange color is because it eats plankton. If it eats corn, it's actually white, and it has added food dye so to make it look pink or coral. So don't eat farmed salmon that was fed corn, because you're getting food dye and omega-6 fatty acids, none of which you will really want. If it's farmed with plankton and antibiotic free, because the other thing is when salmon is farmed with corn, it tends to get disease because it's not used to that food. It's also often in those places where it's more crowded, then they give them antibiotics and you're just getting a bad product, basically.
So here was a question about stevia. Is stevia okay? How does this metabolize?
So this is a very, very good and interesting question, and the jury is still out. So there is some concern of folks consuming large amounts of stevia on an ongoing basis, that there might be an ever so slight carcinogen risk. And we're talking about, for example, Coca-Cola used stevia for a while, and I think they actually withdrew it because there was a concern that for folks that drink, like, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cans of stevia sweetened Coke, that could be problematic. We don't know yet how it affects our metabolism. The problem that we've seen with other artificial sweeteners is that they trigger kind of a paradoxical response, because when we sense sweetness, the body then expects calories to follow, and when they don't, it tends to put forth more of the hunger hormones. So artificial sweeteners are tricky, and you're really best off learning how to like things that have more of the sweetness of what nature gives you, because you see your taste buds will change over time. The sweeter and the more sweet the sweet food you consume, the more the less they will respond to food that isn't that sweet. So in other words, if you're drinking beverages that are really sweet, that are sweetened with artificial sweeteners, and then you go and you eat an apricot, that apricot's not going to taste that sweet to you because your taste sensors are off. Once you get off that oversweet tasting stuff, that apricot is going to be incredibly sweet to you. So really, that is your best bet in the long run.
So there are two more questions. I mean, there's one about granola. Granola is always high in sugar.
Correct.
Are there any no sugar granolas you know of?
There is a company called Ezekiel. They make, it's not quite a granola, but they make a cereal that's very granola-like, that is low in sugar. And the only other thing that I have as an option for you, which is what I do, is you make your own. It's actually not hard to make granola. It's super simple. You just, you know, put, I use honey, a little bit of honey on mine, and you use a fat that you, or an oil, any kind of oil that appeals to you on your oats, and you bake them essentially at 350 degrees and add some nuts and seeds. It's one of the more simple things to do. And that's the best way to control the sugar amount.
Yeah. And finally, actually, there's one more question.
Sure.
More questions, and they're kind of related. I mean, there was one question, a little bit provocative: aren't supplements associated with early death?
Ah, that's a very good question. So, and I know where that comes from. It comes from some research that was done on supplementation with especially some of the antioxidants. And so, you know, that is exactly why I am not a proponent of what we call blanket supplementation, right? So what I mean by that is I believe you should take the supplements that you know that your body needs, and you should not be just taking stuff that you don't need. So this is a bit of a caveat with the multivitamin. So the reason why I mention multivitamins is because some folks can't be bothered with taking the separate stuff that they need to take. And generally speaking, in a multivitamin, you're getting amounts that are, you want to be looking for one that does not go over the RDA, the recommended daily allowance. I forgot to say that earlier on, by the way. So do make sure that it doesn't go over the RDA, the recommended daily allowance. And then there are some challenges also. So for example, when I was a young woman, I smoked like most folks in Europe, right? And as a former smoker, as well as a current smoker, if anyone's a current smoker, research, for example, has shown that taking vitamin A can increase your risk of lung cancer. So yes, there are definitely issues with taking supplements, and that is exactly why you want to be working with someone who can help you figure out what you need. What you don't need is just as important.
And then now really the last question, the best type of fish oil supplement.
Okay, so the best type of fish oil supplement, very good question. First and foremost, you want to be getting it from a company that you want to look for a few things. It has to have, they have to test what they use as a source for toxins, for mercury. They have to also test it for freshness. Okay. And by the way, if a fish oil supplement gives you a real fishy burp, it's rancid. If it's a little tiny little fishy burp, then that's okay. But if you burp, like, you know, that kind of like, oh my God, I can't believe how awful this tastes, throw out your fish oil. It's not a good fish oil. But in terms of amounts, this is really important. So what we are looking for is two things that will be on the ingredient or on the supplement list on the back. EPA, okay, EPA. The other one, DHA. The combination of the two, EPA and DHA, should come up to whatever the serving is of about 1,000 milligrams or somewhere in that realm. Now, I will tell you that lots of fish oil supplements on the front, for example, Costco is an example of that, will say 1,000 milligram of fish oil, okay? Then you look on the back and you see that the active components, the one that we're actually looking for, the EPA and DHA, that there's only like 500 in it. And the rest is fish oil. And we have no clue what kind of fish oil that is. So you are not looking for 1,000 milligrams of fish oil, you're looking for 1,000 milligrams of combined EPA and DHA, freshness, quality, and mercury, making sure they check for mercury. I personally, and I don't have any kind of affiliation with them, I personally like Nordic Naturals. They have a good track record, but I think one company called Carlson is good. Douglas Laboratories is good. I mean, there are lots of companies that are really good, but that's what you want to be looking for. And by the way, fish oil is not a supplement to skimp on. They are expensive, but you do not want to have a fish oil that's rancid, because rancid means oxidation. And remember, oxidation means aging, right? This is what happens to our cells is that they get destroyed essentially by oxidation. So you don't want to add to that by taking a fish oil that will, do that.
Thank you so very much. That concludes our Q&A, and I pass it over to Charlie now for the last word.
Well, the last word is thank you, thank you, thank you. That was an extraordinary presentation on an extraordinarily complicated topic. You made it simple. It made sense. I'm worried to death now.
Uh-oh.
I'll have to deal with that. And I've been trying to be good anyway, but, and particularly the extraordinary answers to all the questions. I think that was just such wonderful answers that you gave. So great deal of appreciation from me and everybody here for you. Thank you, Saskia.
Thank you.
And I'm going to just do a terrible thing. I'm going to go back to being PBS for just a second and just remind you all, if this was good, if you look forward to future presentations of high quality and you feel like making a contribution to Ashby Village, that will help us to continue to put on those wonderful programs. Okay, so feel free to check in with Sue Yin and or anybody in Ashby Village will take your contribution. I'm sure we can work that out. So that is all I have to say. Again, thank you.